The heel shouldn't have been there. One glossy stiletto tipped onto its side on the passenger floor of Aaron's truck. A red sole flashing like a stop sign in the fading light. The late-day heat held the scent of sun-baked asphalt and something sweeter, a trace of a fragrance I didn't wear. The front door gave beneath my hand without a struggle, as if even our lock had decided I didn't need protecting anymore. Down the hall, my heels clicked against wood that suddenly sounded too hard for a home, each step a metronome for a truth I had tried not to imagine. Somewhere beyond the dining room, a low laugh floated out familiar, practiced the kind of laugh that turns heads at luncheons and makes donors feel seen. I paused at the guest room door, my palm flat against cool paint, the scent of jasmine pressed into the air like a fingerprint. In that suspended second, before any words or explanations, I understood that a life can split without shattering, and that the pieces will cut clean if you pick them up with steady hands. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from, in the comments, and if stories about truth and quiet justice keep you company at night, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. My name is Julia Hartman, and for 20 years I made beautiful nights for other people, gala tables that glowed, stages that felt like magic schedules, so seamless, guests thought time was being kind. I grew up in a teacher's house where bills were paid with planning and promises were kept with effort, and I carried that calm into adulthood like a family heirloom. Aaron liked that about me when we met at a hospital fundraiser. He said I made chaos look choreographed, and he was tired of deals that fell apart at the handshake. Savannah arrived in my life soon after all bright eyes and easy charm on the charity circuit. The kind of friend who could make a room loosen its shoulders just by stepping inside. The three of us became a picture people praised: business dinners, lake weekends, holiday open houses where candles flickered in clean glass, and our laughter sounded like proof. Aaron and I built a routine that looked like comfort quick kisses at the door, separate calendars that miraculously met at dinner, quiet Sunday drives out to the nursery for herbs, and a hopeful lemon tree. Savannah and I traded dress links and crisis calls, texted late about seating charts and husbands who worked too much, and swore we'd always say the thing that needed saying. We were the steady ones, or at least that was the story I told when the nights felt longer than they should. If there were ripples, I ironed them flat with tasks and kindness, the way you press a linen napkin until it seems new again. People complimented our glow without noticing the shadows it took to make it visible. Dallas can be loud about success and private about pain, and we fit right in. Aaron's firm expanded into new neighborhoods. My client list grew into a wait list. Savannah's campaigns landed on city billboards that made her grin like she'd found a way to bottle confidence. We dressed for the life we worked, to keep navy suits and silk blouses and shoes that promised we wouldn't stumble. When we did brunch, it was habit and ritual lemon pancakes, too much coffee stories told with hands. If you had asked me then what I feared, I would have said, weather and budgets, not people. I believed loyalty was a decision you made once and refreshed like a password every now and then. The week it happened, I was planning a museum benefit where glass sculptures caught afternoon light and threw it back like quiet applause. Savannah loved the theme and sent me playlists for cocktail hour. Aaron promised to charm a sponsor who needed charming. I told myself the pace explained our distance, that we were busy building the kind of life we'd eventually sit still inside. Even when small things felt off: a missed call, a borrowed perfume that wasn't mine, a pause too long to be harmless, I filed them away as noise a good night's sleep could mute. The truth was crouching in the corner of our ordinary days, waiting for me to turn and see it. That evening, with the sun sliding down the neighbors' roofs and cicadas starting their unhurried chorus, I stepped from my car with a grocery bag and a plan for grilled salmon and soft music. The heel greeted me first, turned wrong like a dropped word, and then the unlocked door offered me a choice. I followed the sound of laughter down the hallway past our framed photos and the lemon tree's stubborn leaf to the guest room where we kept winter blankets and the suitcases we only ever packed together. My hand found the knob. My heartbeat steadied, the air thinned to a thread. When the door opened, the first crack in our perfect picture widened, and what I saw began the story I can't unknow. The first crack didn't roar like thunder, it whispered in little details that should have been harmless. The morning after I found the heel in Aaron's truck, I stood at the kitchen counter with coffee going cold while his phone lit up twice. Both times, it was her name, Savannah Bright, across the screen, paired with messages short enough to be deliberate. I told myself they could have been about work, or about the benefit I was planning, but the knot in my stomach refused the lie. That weekend, Savannah came by with a bottle of white wine and her usual breezy smile leaning against my counter like she had nothing to hide. She poured generously, made a joke about our lemon tree's stubborn leaves, and chattered about new clients. I studied her while she talked, catching the faint trace of a perfume I knew I had smelled in my hallway days earlier. She laughed easily, but her eyes kept darting to her phone, tapping replies that she slid face down on the counter before she looked back up. Aaron came in midway through hair damp from a run, and the air changed. Savannah's tone softened. Her gaze lingered a second too long, and he smiled in a way I hadn't seen in months. It wasn't an ordinary smile. It was lighter, careless, the kind that made me feel like I wasn't even in the room. I excused myself under the pretense of folding laundry, but I stood at the top of the stairs, listening to their voices carry through the open kitchen. Their laughter overlapped, too familiar, too intimate, as if I had been replaced in a space I had built. Later that evening, Aaron wrapped his arms around me in bed, pressing a kiss to the back of my neck like nothing had shifted. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, smelling the faint echo of jasmine that clung to his shirt. My chest felt heavy, as if the weight of 2 decades of marriage pressed down at once. I thought about all the dinners I had planned, the trips we had saved for the favors I had done for Savannah over the years. None of it shielded me from the possibility that loyalty had become optional for them. 3 days later, we met for brunch like we always did. Savannah ordered mimosas, twirling the stem of her glass with practiced ease. She talked about her ex-husband Lucas, rolling her eyes at his attempts to win her back. "Once a cheat, always a cheat," she said with mock conviction, her laughter thin. I nodded, swallowing bitterness that had nothing to do with her ex. I had watched her cry on my couch in sweatpants when her marriage unraveled, watched her mourn the life she swore he had stolen. Now, listening to her call him a mistake, I wondered if she was rewriting history to make room for another betrayal. That night, I sat at my desk, surrounded by notes for an upcoming gala, staring at donor lists that blurred into nothing. My phone buzzed with a picture from Savannah, her cat curled on the couch, captioned, "Wine in hand, alone again." I stared at the message, remembering the lone heel in Aaron's truck, remembering the perfume in the hall. She wasn't alone. She was performing solitude the way some people perform happiness, and I had been the audience too many times to recognize it as truth anymore. The unease grew in places I couldn't explain. Aaron came home later than usual, brushing off questions with quick kisses and half-hearted explanations about meetings that ran long. Savannah kept sending lighthearted text jokes we used to share, but her timing always overlapped with his absences. I began noticing absences in other places too. Longer pauses when Aaron answered simple questions, a lack of warmth in the way he sat across from me at dinner, the way Savannah's eyes flickered when we crossed paths in a crowded room. I didn't confront either of them. Instead, I let the silence do the talking. I watched, noted, and carried the evidence in my chest like an unopened letter. It wasn't weakness that kept me quiet. It was calculation. Some truths don't need to be shouted to be undeniable. I knew if I waited long enough, they would write their confession without even meaning to. One evening, Aaron left his laptop open on the kitchen island. I didn't mean to pry, but when the screen lit up, Savannah's name was there again, an email thread tucked between work messages. I didn't read every word. I didn't need to. The phrases were enough. Last time, can't stop thinking. She'll never know. My hands trembled, but my face stayed calm as I closed the laptop and poured a glass of water. I had all the confirmation I needed, yet no desire to storm or scream. That wasn't the kind of woman I had been raised to be, and it wasn't the kind of woman I would let them reduce me to now. That night, Aaron rolled into bed after midnight muttering apologies about deadlines. I nodded, turned away, and let the silence fill the room. I didn't believe him, but I didn't argue either. Arguing would have given him control, and I had no intention of surrendering that. Savannah texted me the next morning about meeting for coffee, her tone as cheerful as ever. I told her I was busy. I wasn't, but I was learning to measure my presence carefully to decide when and where I would give myself. Each detail added weight: the perfume, the laughter, the messages, the casual lies. None of them alone could break me, but together they began weaving a story I couldn't unsee. Still, I didn't fall apart. I went to work, planned events, smiled at neighbors, and kept every piece of suspicion tucked neatly behind my lips. They thought they were careful, but their carelessness was louder than they realized. I remember standing in my own kitchen one afternoon, folding napkins for a dinner party, when I realized I wasn't even sad anymore. I was sharpening. The betrayal wasn't just between them. It was against the very foundation I had built with both of them. And while they were laughing in borrowed moments, I was growing quiet enough to hear my own resolve forming. I didn't tell my sister Elaine right away. She called that week, asking if I was coming over for Sunday dinner, her voice warm with the patience only an older sister can carry. I almost told her everything, but the words stayed stuck. I wasn't ready to let anyone else see the crack, not yet. Instead, I promised I'd come next time, hung up, and sat in the stillness of my living room until the streetlights came on outside. The silence didn't scare me anymore. It steadied me. Nights turned into a kind of performance I didn't audition for. I lay beside Aaron as he scrolled through his phone, pretending not to notice how often the glow of the screen carried her name. He would murmur about meetings, about deadlines that stretched too late, while I stayed still and quiet, listening to my own pulse in the dark. The sound of his breath should have been steadying, but instead, it pressed against my chest, like a weight I couldn't lift. I learned how to function without showing the fracture. Mornings began with coffee I rarely drank, and I drove to client meetings with lists and smiles ready even when my insides felt hollow. People complimented my calmness, unaware that it was built on holding back tears during the drive between venues. I hosted dinners, accepted invitations, and kept my posture strong at every table. Yet I returned home each night to a silence that no longer soothed. I told myself I could manage, that endurance was enough. But my reflection in the bathroom mirror carried eyes I didn't recognize. Savannah's messages didn't stop. Pictures of her cat notes about new projects, reminders of shared memories that once felt like friendship. Every vibration of my phone was a reminder that she was still claiming space in my life while trespassing in the most private part of it. I started leaving her texts unanswered, but the silence didn't protect me. It only reminded me of how much I had already lost without a word spoken. I would stand in my kitchen at night, staring at the unopened messages, wondering when friendship had become a weapon and when I had allowed it. One Saturday, Elaine called. She asked if I wanted to come to her house for a simple dinner, just roast chicken and salad, nothing complicated. Her voice was warm, full of the kind of steadiness I used to find comforting. I almost said yes, but something heavy stopped me. I told her I had too much work to finish, even though the files on my desk sat untouched. When I hung up, I sat at my dining room table in the half-light, realizing I wasn't protecting her from my pain, I was hiding from her kindness. I tried to release the tension through small rituals. I walked the neighborhood at dusk, passing trimmed lawns and porch lights that flicked on one by one. I listened to the shuffle of leaves and the distant sound of children's laughter, hoping it would anchor me. Some evenings, I would sit on the back porch with a blanket and a glass of wine, watching the lemon tree in its pot stubborn as always. It reminded me of myself, bent but not broken, refusing to die even when neglected. Yet the stillness often dissolved into tears I couldn't hold back. Quiet sobs muffled into the fabric of my sweater. The hardest moments came in ordinary places. At the grocery store, I caught myself reaching for Aaron's favorite cereal and then set the box back on the shelf, embarrassed by the reflex. At events, I watched couples lean into one another and wondered how many smiles hid cracks like mine. Even in church, where I thought prayer might bring relief, I found myself staring at the hymn book without singing because the words felt empty when I could barely trust my own judgment. Betrayal wasn't loud. It seeped in like water, filling every space without permission. One evening, Aaron came home early holding a bouquet of tulips. He set them on the counter with a small smile, as if flowers could erase weeks of suspicion. "Thought you might like these," he said. I touched the petals, cool and delicate, and thanked him with a nod. I didn't ask where he had been before or who he had been thinking of when he chose the color. I placed them in a vase and let them brighten the room, even as the air between us stayed dim. I began writing at night in a notebook I kept in my nightstand. Not letters, not stories, just fragments. Words like hollow perfume, laughter, scribbled across the page in uneven lines. Sometimes I wrote whole sentences, memories of Savannah's voice when she cried on my couch, or the way Aaron used to squeeze my hand during movies. The pages filled slowly, but each word felt like setting down a stone I had carried all day. It didn't fix the pain, but it made it visible, and visibility was the first step to understanding. The weight of keeping silent grew heavier, but so did my clarity. I knew I couldn't live in denial forever, yet I wasn't ready to speak aloud what I had seen and heard. There's a strange safety in silence. It feels like control, even when it's only postponement. I told myself I was observing, gathering, learning, but deep down, I was bracing for the day I could no longer ignore the truth. Every glance, every half smile, every unexplained absence was pushing me closer to that edge. One night, as I washed dishes alone, I caught my own reflection in the kitchen window. My face looked calm, almost serene, but my eyes told another story. They carried exhaustion, suspicion, and the sharp glint of something I hadn't recognized before. Strength. Quiet, cautious strength that comes not from shouting, but from enduring long enough to see clearly. For the first time, I wondered if my silence wasn't weakness at all. Maybe it was sharpening me, preparing me for a decision I had yet to make. I went to bed that night without speaking to Aaron, who had already fallen asleep with the television still glowing. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and knew I couldn't keep burying the truth under routines and polite smiles. I wasn't ready for confrontation, but I was ready for clarity. And that realization carried me into sleep steadier than I had felt in weeks. The silence had been my shield, but it was starting to feel more like a cage. I carried the weight of knowing, yet I hadn't spoken it aloud. Nights beside Aaron grew unbearable, with his excuses settling in the air like smoke I couldn't clear. I told myself I was enduring for strength, but endurance without action began to taste like surrender. The turning point came the evening I saw Savannah's car parked in a quiet corner of a hotel lot, the same one Aaron had mentioned for a business dinner. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and in that moment, I couldn't pretend anymore. I wasn't imagining. I wasn't paranoid. I had been right all along. I didn't confront them that night. Instead, I drove aimlessly until I ended up outside a coffee shop across from a small park. I sat in my car, watching families pack up picnic blankets and couples strolling with dogs. I felt an ache not just for what I had lost, but for what I had allowed to continue unchecked. My silence had given them room, and I realized I couldn't live with that any longer. Something inside me shifted calm, clear, and steady. If they were willing to betray, then I had every right to choose what came next. That weekend, I told Aaron I needed time alone. He frowned, confused, but didn't push. I packed a small bag and drove to a lakeside inn an hour outside Dallas, a place I had used once for a work retreat. The room overlooked still water, and for the first time in weeks, I breathed without watching my words. I journaled late into the night, spilling every detail I had kept inside writing until my hand cramped and my eyes burned. By morning, the words had formed into something that looked less like grief and more like clarity. I couldn't fix what had already broken, but I could decide how I would respond. Elaine called me while I was sitting by the lake with a mug of tea. She asked if I was all right, said my voice had sounded strange the last time we spoke. I paused, then told her part of the truth. Something's wrong, I admitted quietly. I can't ignore it anymore. She was silent for a long moment before answering. Julia, you've always carried too much alone. Whatever it is, you don't have to this time. I didn't share everything yet, but her words stayed with me. They felt like permission to stop pretending, to stop protecting everyone else at my own expense. The following week, I began noticing Aaron's habits with new eyes. His late nights, his sudden defensiveness, the way his phone never left his side. Nothing had changed except me. I had stopped doubting myself. One night, he left the room to take a call, and I sat listening to his muffled voice through the wall. He said her name soft, almost tender. My chest tightened, but the pain didn't undo me this time. It fueled me. I understood then that betrayal wasn't a storm waiting to pass. It was a fact solid as the walls around me. And I was done shrinking inside it. A few days later, I attended a charity planning meeting where Savannah was also present. She walked in with her polished smile and perfect hair, her voice carrying across the room like nothing in the world had shifted. I watched her shake hands, laugh at jokes, and place her notes neatly on the table. Our eyes met briefly, and she held my gaze just a second too long. I saw the flicker, the awareness that I might know. She smoothed her papers quickly, but the air between us felt heavy, as though we were both playing roles on a stage neither of us wanted to admit we built. I stayed calm, offered no confrontation, but something inside me said the performance couldn't last much longer. That night, I called Lucas. It had been years since we spoke beyond polite greetings at events, but I knew he had been through his own betrayals with Savannah. My voice shook slightly as I asked if he had time to meet. He hesitated, then agreed, and we settled on a quiet jazz bar downtown. When I arrived, he was already there, his hands wrapped around a glass he hadn't touched. He looked up with a tired smile and said, I thought I was done with this kind of pain. I nodded, sliding into the booth across from him. So did I whispered. We didn't need many words. I told him what I had seen, what I suspected, and his eyes closed, as if the confirmation both hurt and relieved him. She hasn't changed, he said finally. But neither have you. Julia, you've always been steady, and she's always chased chaos. I stared at the table, tracing the grain of the wood with my fingertip. I can't keep pretending. I need to do something. He leaned back, watching me carefully. Then do it. But do it your way, not hers. Don't let her drag you into her fire. His words planted themselves deep inside me, a reminder that any step I took had to be rooted in dignity, not destruction. When I returned home that evening, Aaron was waiting in the kitchen. He asked where I had been, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. I told him I had gone out with an old friend, nothing more. He studied me, perhaps realizing that something in me had shifted. I didn't offer details, and for once, I didn't feel the urge to. Silence was no longer my weakness, it had become my boundary. He poured himself a drink, muttered about being tired, and went upstairs. I stayed at the counter, letting the hum of the refrigerator fill the room, and thought about the path unfolding in front of me. The days that followed felt different. The pain was still there, but it no longer drowned me. Instead, it pressed me toward action, toward reclaiming the space I had surrendered. I began drafting new boundaries, quietly but firmly. I canceled a dinner Savannah had invited me to host, claiming scheduling conflicts. I stopped covering for Aaron when he missed family gatherings, telling people the truth instead of offering excuses. Each small step was a crack of light through the wall of silence I had built, and with each one, I felt myself returning. The moment of realization wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost gentle. I was sitting in my office, surrounded by event notes, when I looked up and caught my reflection in the window. For the first time in months, I saw strength instead of doubt. My marriage, my friendship, the world I thought was unshakable, had been fractured, but I wasn't broken. I was awake. And now I was ready to move from watching to acting. I had carried suspicion long enough to let it carve me sharp. By the time I admitted the truth to myself, I no longer trembled. I was ready to move quietly with care, one step at a time. The first decision was not to confront, but to prepare. Shouting could be denied, but silence with intention could not. If they wanted a stage for their betrayal, I would build one where the lights revealed everything they thought they had hidden. I called Lucas again this time, without hesitation. We met at the same jazz bar, its dim light catching the brass edges of framed photographs on the walls. He looked steadier than before, as if my invitation had given him purpose. I slid into the booth across from him, placed my hands flat on the table, and said, "If they can betray us so easily, then they should learn what it feels like to be seen." He studied my face, quiet for a long moment, before nodding slowly. "Then we'll do it together. But it has to be smart." That night, over half-empty glasses, we began sketching the outline of a plan neither of them would see coming. We started small, a public coffee together at a cafe where Savannah often stopped between meetings. She walked in that morning, and I felt her presence before I saw her. Lucas leaned in as if sharing a quiet story, his voice low enough to draw her curiosity, but not her ear. When I lifted my cup to sip, Savannah froze in the doorway, recognition flickering across her expression, before she smoothed it away. She ordered quickly, left without lingering, but her eyes cut back once more as she pushed through the door. Lucas exhaled a short laugh. "She'll tell him before sunset," he said. I only nodded. That was the point. The next week, I attended a gallery opening. It was a fundraiser for a local arts program, the kind of place where Aaron often appeared for networking. Lucas joined me at the entrance, dressed simply, but with quiet confidence. We walked in together, not close enough to look romantic, but close enough for people to notice. I didn't search for Aaron, but I knew when he saw us. His voice faltered mid-conversation, and though he tried to hide it, his jaw tightened in the way it always did when he was unsettled. I smiled politely at a donor leaning slightly toward Lucas, as if sharing a thought, and let Aaron's stare burn from across the room. At home later, Aaron's questions came out disguised as small talk. How was the gallery? Who did you go with? I answered plainly, Lucas. We're working on a project together. He hesitated, his eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second. Interesting was all he said before turning away. That word carried more weight than he intended. He was watching now, and watching meant doubting. I wanted him to feel every ounce of that uncertainty. Savannah's reaction arrived through silence. Her texts grew less frequent, shorter, almost brittle. The cheerful photos stopped, replaced with practical notes about events as though friendship had been folded back into business. I didn't respond to most of them. My absence was louder than any accusation. One night, she sent a single line. You and Lucas seem close. I stared at the words on my phone, let the message sit unanswered, and placed the phone face down. The power was shifting slowly but surely. Lucas and I became careful with each move. We were not reckless, nor did we pretend affection we didn't feel. Instead, we presented something harder to dismiss: composure. We attended a wine tasting together where Aaron's colleagues spotted us and greeted us warmly. The story would travel on its own. We didn't need to help it. At one point, Lucas leaned back in his chair, watching the swirl of red in his glass, and said, "You're not doing this out of spite, are you?" I shook my head. "No. I'm doing it to reclaim what they tried to take. My dignity. My choice." He lifted his glass slightly, as though in agreement, and we let the clinking of glasses around us cover the weight of the moment. Meanwhile, I shifted how I carried myself at home. I stopped waiting for Aaron's explanations. If he came in late, I no longer asked why. If he disappeared for weekends of conferences I didn't press. Instead, I filled my time with work dinners with colleagues and quiet evenings at Elaine's house. My sister noticed the change, but didn't push. She simply placed an extra portion of food on my plate and let me sit in her kitchen, surrounded by warmth that didn't require performance. For the first time in weeks, I laughed without forcing it. The plan wasn't just to make them wonder, it was to let them stew in their own choices. Every moment of doubt, every whisper they heard, every photo they imagined, became a mirror to their own betrayal. I wanted them to feel the unease I had lived with for months. But I also wanted to remain untouchable beyond their reach, beyond their attempts to control the story. That balance required patience, and patience was something I had finally learned to wield. One evening, Lucas and I sat in my kitchen finalizing details for the next phase. The air smelled of roasted garlic and fresh bread. I had cooked more than either of us could eat. He leaned against the counter, papers spread before him as we quietly discussed an upcoming gala Savannah was organizing. "This will be the perfect place," he said. "All eyes, all cameras. They won't be able to pretend." I looked at the invitation card, Savannah's name in elegant print, and felt something like resolve settle into my bones. "Then we'll give them the show they've earned," I said softly. When Lucas left that night, I stood alone in my doorway, listening to the click of his car door and the fade of his engine. The house felt different, not empty, but ready. I realized I no longer dreaded what was coming. I welcomed it. The first cracks in their armor had already formed, and soon, with one deliberate move, the fracture would split wide open. The night of Savannah's gala arrived with the weight of inevitability. For weeks, Lucas and I had shaped each step with precision, knowing this event would be their stage as much as ours. I slipped into a navy gown that brushed the floor, simple yet deliberate, and let the satin fabric whisper confidence I no longer needed to fake. Lucas arrived at my door in a black suit, steady as ever, and when I caught his eye, there was no hesitation. We weren't walking into chaos. We were walking into control. The Dallas Museum of Art glowed with tall windows and marble floors polished to a shine. Inside, donors and executives moved between sculptures and candlelit tables, their voices low but eager. Savannah's name was printed at the bottom of the program chair of the evening, and I knew how much of herself she had tied to this moment. Aaron stood near the entrance, a glass in hand, already restless. When Lucas placed his hand gently at the small of my back as we stepped in together, Aaron's gaze snapped toward us. He tried to mask it, but the flicker of panic betrayed him. Savannah noticed too. Her smile was stretched thin, her laugh pitched a shade higher, her glass trembling slightly before she set it down. We didn't rush to them. That was the point. We mingled with donors, spoke calmly with acquaintances, and let the room carry whispers on its own. I felt their eyes following us, Savannah's sharp with fury, Aaron's uncertain with fear. Lucas leaned down at one point, his voice low and even. They're unraveling faster than we expected. I nodded, keeping my smile soft for the people we were speaking with. The revenge wasn't in confrontation. It was in composure. Halfway through the evening, a volunteer announced the major donations from the stage. Lucas and I had arranged ours carefully, a contribution in Savannah's name announced just before dinner. The room erupted in polite applause, cameras flashing toward her table. She was forced to rise, to smile, to acknowledge a gift she had neither given nor approved. Her eyes darted to me, fury flashing beneath her practiced grace. Aaron sat stiffly beside her, clapping once before dropping his hands into his lap. The message was clear. They weren't in control anymore. Later, I stepped onto the terrace for air. The night was cool, city lights glowing against the dark sky. I had barely taken a sip from my glass when Savannah appeared. She didn't waste time on greetings. "You've made your point," she said tightly, her voice low but sharp. I turned, meeting her stare, without flinching. "Which one?" I asked, letting the question hang between us. Her lips pressed thin, her composure slipping. "He doesn't love you. He's just using you to get to me." I tilted my head calm. "That's interesting, because that's exactly what you did with him." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, words failing her for once. She turned on her heel and walked away first. That was the victory, quiet, undeniable. When I returned inside, Lucas was waiting by the bar. He lifted his glass slightly. "She bite?" he asked. "Hard," I replied, "but not deep enough." We toasted silently, the crystal clinking faintly as Aaron watched from across the room, confusion etched into his face. Savannah's fury, his unease, it was all unraveling exactly as we had planned. They couldn't understand how I could move so calmly, how silence had become sharper than any outburst. They had never learned to suffer quietly, and now it was their turn to feel the weight of it. By the end of the evening, we had spoken with every donor, every journalist, every face that mattered. Our composure was the story, not their betrayal. When Lucas escorted me to the waiting car, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Their world was already cracking. The image they had built together could not survive the quiet precision of what they had just endured. Back home, I slipped out of the gown and stood at my window, watching the city lights fade into night. I thought I would feel triumphant, but what I felt was steadier than that. Not a rush, not a blaze, just certainty. I had taken back control without raising my voice. And tomorrow, the whispers would spread without my help. For the first time in months, I breathed without pain. The gala had been their stage, but I had written the script. And as I closed the curtain on that night, I knew the performance was only beginning. The morning after the gala, the ripple began. My phone lit up with messages from colleagues and acquaintances, congratulations, curious remarks, compliments wrapped in speculation. None of them mentioned Savannah directly, but I knew whose name hovered unspoken in every text. When I stepped into a client meeting that week, people looked at me differently, not with pity, but with respect, edged by curiosity. Word had spread without my help. and Savannah's perfect image was already cracking. Aaron grew restless at home. He paced the kitchen, scrolled his phone obsessively, and asked clipped questions he didn't wait for me to answer. One evening, he finally confronted me. "You think you've embarrassed me parading around with Lucas?" His voice was sharp, but beneath it was fear. I set my glass down and met his gaze. "No, Aaron. You embarrassed yourself." The silence after was heavier than any argument we had ever had. He left the room first, and I knew he had no defense. Savannah tried to recover by doubling down on appearances. She posted polished photos from the gala, smiling in gowns beside donors writing captions about success and gratitude. But the comments told a different story. Whispers had made their way online, and though no one named the betrayal outright, the questions in those comments tightened around her like a net. She couldn't charm her way out of what people had already seen. For someone who built her life on control of perception, the unraveling was its own kind of sentence. Lucas kept me informed quietly. He heard, through mutual friends, that Savannah's board had started asking questions, worried her personal life was seeping into her professional reputation. At the same time, Aaron's business partners grew cautious, unwilling to associate with someone entangled in public whispers. The fallout wasn't sudden or loud. It was slow, steady, and relentless. Exactly the way silence works when you let it carry the weight. I didn't celebrate their collapse. I simply carried on with my work. I attended meetings, planned events, and kept my posture steady while they scrambled. At a luncheon 2 weeks later, I caught Savannah watching me from across the room. Her smile faltered when I didn't look away. She had always been the one to command a crowd, but now she seemed smaller. Her shine dimmed under the weight of suspicion. She left before dessert was served, and the quiet she left behind was louder than her presence had ever been. Aaron's final attempt came one late evening. He sat at the dining table, hands clasped tightly together. "We can fix this, Julia," he said, voice lower than I'd heard in months. "I made a mistake, but we don't have to let it destroy everything." I studied him for a long time, the man I had once trusted with my whole life. "It wasn't one mistake, Aaron. It was every choice you made after." His shoulders sagged, and he had no reply. That was the moment I knew he wasn't just losing me. He was losing the story he had told himself about who he was. I filed for separation quietly, without drama. Elaine sat with me at the lawyer's office, her presence steady and grounding. She didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. She simply held the silence with me, letting me feel the relief of taking a step I had avoided for too long. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not free yet, but finally moving toward it. Meanwhile, Savannah's charity board voted to suspend her chair position pending review. Lucas called me that evening, his tone even but weighted. "She's furious," he said. "But it's not about us anymore. It's about everything she built unraveling at once." I thanked him not for the news, but for standing with me through it all. We didn't linger on the past. Neither of us needed to. What we had done was enough. The weeks that followed brought small moments of peace I hadn't expected. I walked through the arboretum with Elaine on a Saturday morning, the air warm with spring. She squeezed my hand and said, "You look like yourself again." I smiled, not because I believed I was back to who I had been, but because I knew I was becoming someone steadier, someone who had survived the storm without losing her dignity. Aaron moved out quietly, leaving behind ties and shirts. I didn't bother returning. Savannah retreated from public events, her name whispered less often in the circles she once dominated. Their world was collapsing, not from anything dramatic I had done, but from the truth finally shining where they couldn't cover it. Justice had never been about destroying them. It was about refusing to be destroyed by them. And that was already complete. Still, There was one final step I knew I would need to take, not for them, but for myself. The past had been burned into every corner of my house, my work, my silence. If I was going to move forward, I would have to let go fully. That thought carried me into the last part of this story, where the lesson wasn't about revenge anymore, but about reclamation. Aaron's departure left the house quieter than it had ever been, but the silence no longer suffocated me. I filled it with small routines that were mine alone: fresh flowers in the entryway, tea brewed before sunrise, candles lit in the evenings just because I enjoyed the glow. Each ritual reminded me that my life was no longer bound by his excuses or Savannah's intrusions. Their chaos had been removed, and what remained was space I could finally claim as my own. Savannah's fall from grace came slowly, the way reputations often do. One board quietly replaced her with someone less complicated, another postponed renewing her contract, and soon she wasn't mentioned at all in circles where her voice once dominated. Aaron's business began to suffer too. Partners who once sought his charm now hesitated, not wanting whispers to brush against their names. I didn't need to lift a hand. Time and truth had done the work for me. Watching it unfold, I felt no thrill, only relief. Justice didn't have to be loud to be complete. Lucas and I saw each other occasionally, often by chance at community events or shared gatherings. We didn't dwell on the past, and we didn't pretend to be more than what we were: two people who had walked through betrayal and found a strange kind of kinship in survival. There was comfort in that recognition, quiet and unspoken. Elaine remained my anchor, checking in without pressing, offering Sunday dinners that reminded me family could still mean safety. I learned that leaning on someone else didn't make me weak. It made me whole. One afternoon, I returned to the Arboretum with a journal tucked in my bag. Sitting beneath a wide oak, I read through the words I had once scribbled in grief. Hollow perfume silence. I turned the page and added new ones: peace, strength, renewal. The handwriting looked steadier, my hand no longer trembling. It struck me then how healing often arrives in increments, not in grand gestures. I had expected to feel victorious, but what I felt was softer. I felt restored. By summer, I had moved into a smaller house filled with light. I painted the walls a soft cream, planted herbs in the kitchen window, and invited friends to share meals around a wooden table that fit just right. There were no echoes of lies in that space, only the hum of conversation and laughter that felt genuine. My work shifted too. I turned down clients who treated me like background choosing. Instead, projects that aligned with my own sense of purpose. For the first time in years, I wasn't stretching myself thin to hold up other people's stories. I was building my own. Looking back now, I see that the revenge I thought I wanted wasn't about destroying Aaron or Savannah. The real justice was in choosing not to let them destroy me. Their downfall came from their own choices. My strength came from refusing to be defined by them. Dignity isn't something you can take from someone, it's something you surrender. And I had learned how to keep mine, even in the fire. My name is Julia Hartman, and I no longer live in the wreckage. I live in the rebuild where light slips through every crack, and silence no longer means absence, it means peace. If betrayal taught me anything, it's that endings can become beginnings, and that strength is often born in the quietest moments. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey stayed with you the most. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories like this bring you comfort, stay connected here for more.